$6,300 suit. Come on.
Hi there.
What's he doing here?
Merry Christmas to you too, Uncle Job.
Everything all right?
Just don't want people's kids getting their sticky little fingers all over these $2,600 pans.
Oh yeah, you think they're gonna go right for the pants, do you?
Okay,
Come on.
okay. So should
Arrested Development is the story of a wealthy family who lost everything, and the only son who had one choice to keep them all together. But just how much did the Bluths actually lose? Aside from Michael and his son, the family is pretty terrible at saving money. That's why today we're talking about just how much the Bluths are worth. And unfortunately, I couldn't afford Ron Howard for the voiceover. But before we get into the video, make sure you subscribe down below if you want to see more content like this. Follow me on Twitter at 10kbill to tell me about whatever I missed. And of course, spoilers for the entire series are ahead. And while I tried to wait for the second part of Season 5 to come out, I figured I'd just pull the trigger to get this video out there. Of course, immediately after I started editing this, they announced Season 5's release date. I'll post a follow-up video or something if anything major happens in that. The earliest we hear of anything involving the Bluth Company is the mention that the banana stand has been a staple to the boardwalk since 1953. However, we later learned that George had stolen the idea from An Yong's grandfather and had him deported to Korea. The earliest the Bluth Company would be able to be created would be 1956. We know this because Lucille met Oscar while she was working as a USO entertainer, and Oscar was working as a croc spotter in Vietnam. The Vietnam War didn't officially start until November of 1955, so Lucille couldn't have left Oscar for George until 1956 at the very earliest, which is what we'll assume. One other thing that is stated in the series is that George's first plot of land that he develops is done through a monetary gift from Jack Dorso, also known as Uncle Jack. Jack gifts him the money after what is a presumed sexy time with Lucille. Now at this point, we'll figure out just how much the Bluth Company is making each year. To do this, we'll do similar math to what we did in our Frank Reynolds video. In that video, we talked about the real estate company that Frank was running, so the math should be pretty similar aside from one thing. The Bluths are focusing on real estate development, while Frank's company is more involved in investment. So we'll go through the same beats as we did for that video. LA has 422.54% more homes than Philadelphia, and real estate development has profit margins that are 56.66 higher than investment. This would bring the Bluth Company to an evaluation of $246,920,714.17 today, versus the $37,301,953.40 that Frank's company would be worth. But wait! I'm sure at least some of you are going down to comment, what about when we find out that everyone has $2 million worth of stocks? Well, if we go off that math, since everyone has 5% of the company would be valued at $40 million. However, this is the company at its absolute lowest. Remember that through the series, the company is losing money. Its founder and former CEO is in prison for treason as well as embezzlement. The company switches CEOs like every other week, and the company's major stockholders aren't exactly keeping a low profile during all of this. Because of all of this, I believe that what the series says the company is valuated at 2006 is the lowest of the low for the company. So we'll be going with the higher number, adjusting it for real estate prices for each year. Now let's talk about just how much the company is paying out in stocks. With how fast the family is able to lose control of the company when one person in this family sells their stocks, we'll be assuming that the family has 51% of the company's stocks. The average real estate development company pays out 5%, meaning that today it would be paying out $12,346,035.74. We'll also be giving George a CEO salary that we'll be adjusting each year as well. We also know about a bunch of purchases and side hustles that occur throughout the series, but we'll be tackling those and everything else we'll be talking about in chronological order. And finally, before we push on any further, let's talk about how we're doing our math. Each year that the company is functioning, we'll be adjusting the company's worth to find out how much the company is paying out to the family, taking George's salary into consideration, adding those up along with any extra income that the family might be gaining from. We'll then subtract any expenses the family might have, or if it's a major purchase that couldn't be afforded by that way, we'll take it out of their bank account. After that, we'll take off the appropriate amount for taxes and put 20%, or 20% for now, of the remainder into a bank account to accrue interest. So now let's finally get going. The first 2 years would go by relatively uneventfully until 1960. This is when we'll be having George and Lucille buy their penthouse apartment. So in order to figure out just how much their penthouse likely costs, let's first try and figure out which floor their apartment is on. In Season 3, Episode 3, George falls off the balcony and falls for 5.75 seconds before hitting the ground. After some quick math, we can see that he fell 162.12 meters, or a little over 49 stories. Which honestly should have killed him, but it's a TV show and he's a main character, so yeah. So we'll be rounding the building up to 50 stories, with the penthouse being on the top floor. A similar penthouse today would cost just shy of $1.6 million, which back in 1960 would have gone for around $213,920. At this point, George and Lucille would have $75,761.12 in their bank account, so they couldn't just buy it outright at the time. Instead, we'll be taking out $50,000 for down payment, leaving them with $25,761.12, and taking the rest out of the 80% that they aren't saving each year. We'll fast forward again just a few years to 1963. This is the year that George Bluth officially opens the banana stand. Again, while we hear early in the series that the banana stand had been around since 1953, we later see a photo of George cutting the ribbon at the opening of the banana stand in 1963. This seems to confirm the subplot that George stole the banana stand from An Young's grandfather, later getting him deported. While the banana stand is seen as a staple on the boardwalk, I don't think George is making a killing off of it, mostly using it as a place to hide money.
Just remember that you're playing with fire.
There's $250,000 lining the walls of the banana stand.
What?
Cash, Michael.
Why didn't you tell me that?
How much clearer can I say? There's always money in the banana stand! No touching! No touching!
So, since he has workers working there full time, I'll be estimating him at around $15,000 today, which we'll be adjusting for each year. And that'll be that until 1967, when the couple has their first child, George Oscar Bluth, or Job, which, as someone from Pennsylvania, I want to pronounce Gob with every ounce of my being. Anyways, what we're going to be doing for each child is taking away $200,000 each year for each child. And since most of the children continue to live off their parents' money, the only time we'll be taking away from this will be when Michael turns 18. Mostly because Michael is the only person attempting to really have his own life away from his parents' money. Yes, he eventually works for the Bluth Company, but he's the only responsible one and the only one who I don't think is continually asking his parents for money. But anyways, let's pop back to 1968, just 1 year later, when the Bluths both give birth to Michael and adopt Lindsay, telling her she's actually Michael's twin. So as we stated, we'll be adding $400,000 onto what they're spending on their kids each year, and coming out of 1968, the Bluths have $322,722.85. Lucille's final biological son, Buster, is born in 1972. This future mother boy is the last child we'll be actively taking into consideration for the foreseeable future, giving us $800,000 that George and Lucille are spending on their children each year. Coming out of 1972, the Bluths have $495,476.29. And we'll jump ahead 3 more years to 1975. I believe that this is when the Bluths bought their cabin, which George mainly uses for his affairs, that is first seen in a 1976 flashback when George refuses to take Michael to the cabin. A similar cabin today can go for around $120,000. Back in 1975, that cabin would have cost $23,111.81. This means that coming out of 1975, the Bluths have $645,802.32. 2 years later, in 1977, George would launch a couple of new business ventures to gain a little extra money. The first of these would be George's invention, the cornballer. While illegal in the US and basically everywhere else, the cornballer sold well in Mexico. Well enough actually that when George faked his death in Mexico, he got his own political cartoon. However, because it's still illegal basically everywhere and because so many people have burns on their hands and arms because of it, I still don't think it sold exceptionally well. So I'll be estimating that George was able to make the equivalent of $60,000 for the next several years, until people realized just how dangerous the cornballers actually were and the class action lawsuits began to come in. The next business venture that George would get into would be the Boy Fights VHSs. The fights were originally used to teach Job and Michael to be competitive and to help them become tougher. Buster would also make appearances in shorts throughout the films. The films sold alright, with Buster being able to use his minor celebrity to gain attention while he fakes being in a coma. We'll be giving George the equivalent of $10,000 each year for the next several years until Job turns 18. Coming out of 1977, the Bluths have $806,612.32. The next several years go by until we reach 1983, the year of Lindsay's nose job. We see in a flashback that Lucille spent $3,000 on the surgery, as she clearly has it written on a check. And just a few years later, in 1987, Michael would go to college. Knowing Michael and how well he likely did in high school, he probably got some kind of scholarship and a little assistance from his parents, who would probably want him to take over the Bluth family business at some point. So at this point, we'll be taking the amount the Bluths are spending on their children down by $200,000. In 1989, Lucille and George spend $130,000 on fertility treatments to help Lindsay get pregnant with her daughter Maybe. We'll be taking that off of what George and Lucille are making that year. Coming out of 1989, the family has $4,323,479.18. From here, we fast forward out of the 80s into the year 1990. This is the year I think the Bluth family buys their beach home. When Michael finds out that the family didn't actually sell the home after his wife died, they'd spent her final few months there. Lucille mentions that if they'd sold the home at the time, they would have lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. We hear the narrator say in season 1 that Michael's wife had been dead for 2 years.
Your wife's on line 1.
Michael's wife had been dead for 2 years.
My what?
Kitty realized her mistake,
I said your wife is on line 1.
but not immediately.
Meaning she had died in 2001. The closest LA home prices were to what they were in 2001 would be in 1990. A similar home in LA today could go for around $1.95 million, and back in 1990 it would go for close to $1,020,825. We'll be taking that off the amount the Bluths are bringing in this year. And around this time we'll be taking the amount the family is saving up to 30% to try and account for the fact that they're using some company money on personal objects. One final thing to talk about from the 90s, in 1998 George Bluth was hired to build homes in Iraq for Saddam Hussein. However, we later find out that this was part of a CIA sting to spy on Saddam. We won't be adding any money onto what he's making because we find out that Saddam actually never paid for some of the homes. Now let's move into the new millennium and up to the year 2001. After Michael's wife dies and the family lies to him about selling their beach home, they do what any normal family would do in that situation: buy a yacht. We don't really have to do any research into what a similar yacht would be worth because they outright say how much the yacht is worth: $700,000. Coming out of 2001, the Bluths would have $16,283,091.71. And from here, we can get to the beginning of the series, which is when the Bluths are at their most wealthy. Right before George is arrested incredibly publicly and their stock prices would plummet, George's accounts would likely be frozen, and the family would essentially squander their wealth. I mean, Ron Howard says it pretty straightforward in the opening of the show. The family doesn't change their spending and goes through the money that George had saved up relatively quickly. There are several times throughout the series that Lucille isn't able to go to her country clubhouse because they can't afford the dues. So we'll be ending our math the year before the show begins in 2002. Now before we get into the final numbers, let's talk about a couple things that you might bring up from the series. In the first season, Job explodes the yacht for an illusion. During this, he claims that the yacht is insured for $900,000. However, the yacht is on video exploding. The fact Job wasn't arrested for insurance fraud leads me to believe that they don't go forward with the claim and simply write it off as a loss. The second thing being the jet that Michael sells in the first season. It's pretty specifically stated as a corporate jet, so the money would go right back into the company in an attempt to keep the business afloat. So now, let's move on to the moment of truth. By 2002, the Bluths would have $17,889,801.14 saved up. Their penthouse would be worth $1,085,280. The beach house would be worth $1,431,444.68. The cabin, which is sold later in the series, is worth $82,187.31, and a yacht that's worth $700,000. So now let's add everything up to see that right at the beginning of the series, the Bluths are worth $21,188,713.13. And honestly, if George wasn't arrested for building homes for Saddam, the family would be worth a lot more now, if they didn't go bankrupt during the housing market crash. But hey, that's not quite the right channel. Pat, please hire me. This has been 10K Bill, and thanks for watching. If you like this show and want to help us make more, consider supporting us on our Patreon. Comment down below what you'd like to hear me talk about next, and make sure you subscribe for all your entertainment-related content.